The sky had wept for days over the valleys of Pennsylvania, rain pounding rooftops, rivers swelling beyond their banks, and the quiet townspeople of Johnstown scarcely noticing the ominous hum beneath the roar of the storm. At 3:10 in the afternoon on May 31st, 1889, a sound erupted that would forever haunt the Allegheny foothills, a deep rolling crash that seemed to shake the very earth. The South Fork Dam had given way. Millions of gallons of Lake Conemaugh, held for decades by human hands, surged forward with a vengeance, an unstoppable wall of water 40 miles per hour, sweeping everything before it, crushing homes, tearing apart bridges, pulling 33 locomotives into the raging current like toys. Streets vanished beneath the relentless flood. Screams echoed over the roaring tide, mingling with the crash of timber and steel. Families disappeared in the blink of an eye, singular disappearances, fate unknown. And yet, amidst the terror tales emerged that defied reason. A baby clinging to the floor of a floating house drifted more than 70 miles downstream. Survivors clambered atop debris, only to be swallowed by fire as the bridge caught flame from the wreckage it trapped. Newspaper accounts would later describe the scene as a valley turned to chaos, a city drowned in fury, lives erased in an instant, and even now the details leave a shiver, a lingering pulse of disbelief. Before we move forward, take a breath. Imagine the roar, the destruction, and leave in the comments where you are watching from. Share the moment that chills you most as you step into the singular horror that was the Johnstown flood. May 1889. Johnstown, Pennsylvania lay cradled in the valley formed by the confluence of the Little Conemaugh Stony Creek and the mighty Allegheny River. A settlement of 30,000 souls, many drawn by the promise of steel and industry, by the hum of factories and the scent of smoke and coal that lingered in the morning air. The valley was both a cradle and a trap, hemmed in by rolling hills and ridges that had seen centuries of rain, snow, and wind. A place where the rivers could swell without mercy. A place known in whispers for its floods, its dark water stories, its singular disappearances that older townsfolk recalled with nervous glances and stories passed by firelight. In 1840, almost half a century before the catastrophe engineers had constructed the South Fork Dam, a massive earthen wall of 900 feet length and 72 feet height, creating Lake Conemaugh, the largest man-made lake of its time. It was built as part of a canal system, a channel of commerce meant to connect distant towns through waterways, now almost forgotten, obsolete, overtaken by the roaring iron rails of the railroad. But as the canal fell into disuse, the lake and its dam were left in the hands of those who had little incentive to maintain it. Neglect, layering over ambition, small repairs ignored weak points forming in silence beneath the surface, invisible until the day the dam spoke in the language of destruction. For days, rain had fallen steadily, a relentless drumbeat on roofs, streets, and hillsides. The people of Johnstown were accustomed to storms, to floods that would rage and recede. But there was something different this time, something the farmers and steelworkers could not name. A heavy tension in the air, the rivers swelling, foaming their waters darkened by debris and mud. At the dam, the spillway choked on fallen trees, branches, and sediment, a silent warning that went unheeded. Engineers and caretakers watched with unease, sensing a growing pressure, the water climbing with each passing hour, whispering threats across the valley. But the warnings could not travel fast enough. The telegraph lines were down, and the horsemen sent to warn nearby villages carried messages into the wind unheard. The stage was set, the air thick with anticipation and dread, as if nature itself had paused, holding its breath. Johnstown itself was a hive of human activity that morning. Steel mills spat smoke into the gray sky chimneys, framing the horizon like gaunt sentinels over the river. Workers traversed narrow streets. Carts rumbled over cobblestones slick with rain, and children played near the banks, oblivious to the swelling danger. The town was alive with normalcy, laughter, arguments, the mundane rhythm of daily life. But beneath the surface of that life, the valley carried a dark promise. Locals recalled older floods, partial and deadly. A 1,000-year memory in the valley's soil whispered tales of houses lifted from foundations of livestock, drowned of families missing without trace. Old newspapers chronicled each singular occurrence, each fate, unknown tales of destruction that seemed to repeat in cycles as if Johnstown itself were cursed by geography and human ambition. Lake Conemaugh, the serene mirror atop the hills, seemed unremarkable, that morning mist rising from its surface like ghostly veils hiding the boiling tension beneath. The waters had been building, climbing over weak points, pooling behind the compromised dam, a silent, unstoppable force, held back only by clay and stone, by human overconfidence. Residents would later describe a strange stillness before the roar, a hush in the rain, a quiet that pressed upon the valley as if the earth were holding its breath. That quiet was deceptive. And then the warning signs began, creaking noises in the wooden structures, small leaks along the embankment water, oozing where it should not have been. But these warnings were subtle, easily dismissed by men accustomed to the sounds of industry, to the moans of aged machinery, to the occasional groan of the land under heavy rains. There was no way for the town to truly understand the magnitude of the danger, no comprehension of the singular catastrophe gathering just miles above them. Those who noticed signs feared embarrassment or ridicule or perhaps doubted their own judgment. They could not imagine the scale of what was coming, the total annihilation that would descend in minutes, obliterating everything in its path. The dam itself, massive yet fragile in its neglect, carried centuries of ambition and neglect within its walls. Its history was a patchwork of repairs and compromises, human errors layered upon natural pressure. Engineers had studied its weaknesses, yet even they could not predict the sudden collapse that would unleash a wall of water, nor the speed at which it would travel down the narrow valley, gathering power, uprooting trees, smashing houses, twisting bridges into grotesque sculptures of steel and timber. Upstream, the lake seemed calm, but below, in the towns and villages nestled along the river, the citizens unknowingly awaited the horror, the singular event that would leave a mark on history and folklore forever. Even now, as one reads the accounts in newspapers, diaries, and official reports, a chill remains. The facts alone tell of more than 2,000 lives, lost homes obliterated and trains pulled into oblivion. But the valley carries more than facts. It carries whispers of the lost stories of survival that strain belief and the dark allure of the unknown, the supernatural echoes of a disaster where human effort was powerless against the relentless will of nature. The context is more than geography, more than rainfall statistics. It is the collision of human ambition, negligence, and the merciless forces of water, gravity, and time, a perfect storm poised to erase Johnstown in the blink of an eye. In this valley, history and legend intertwine. Survivors recalled voices calling from debris, shadows moving against the currents, strange presences along the riverbanks in the days that followed. Tales passed down in hushed tones spoke of the baby that drifted 70 miles on a floating house of fires that consumed the living and the dead alike, of the bridge that trapped debris only to ignite, creating a furnace atop the floodwaters. These stories would seed folklore, creating a layer of legend atop the undeniable tragedy, a haunting echo that makes the valley's history not only factual, but eerily alive, resonant with the singular human experience of encountering nature's raw, unyielding power. And so in May of 1889, Johnstown sat on the edge of oblivion, oblivious, unaware, yet destined for a catastrophe that would be remembered forever. The valley, the dam, the people, all actors in a drama of unimaginable scale where human life and natural force collided, and the stage was set for a flood that would claim more than 2,000 souls and leave an imprint on history, memory, and folklore that would ripple for generations to come. The morning of May 31st had begun like any other in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, yet records, diaries, and newspaper clippings hint at a tension barely understood, a subtle unease carried on the wind. The skies had wept relentlessly, the rivers swelled with unnatural haste, wrote the Johnstown Tribune in an edition that would later be remembered for its prescient dread. Farmers noted the rise of the Little Conemaugh River, observing how the banks were overtaken more swiftly than any flood in memory. Yet there was no notion of the singular catastrophe looming upstream. Engineers on the South Fork Dam, acutely aware of the hazards, recorded in their private notes that the spillway was clogged with debris and that minor leaks along the earthen embankment suggested an impending failure, yet they were powerless to mobilize an effective warning. Attempts to alert the downstream communities via telegraph failed. The wires had been severed by the storm, leaving Johnstown unsuspecting, immersed in the mundane rhythm of daily life, unaware that fate itself had already decided their path. By early afternoon, eyewitnesses would later recall seeing ominous signs, timbers shifting along the dam water, spilling erratically over the weakened structure. But many could not interpret the meaning, attributing the strange occurrences to the relentless rain or their own imaginations. There was a rumble beneath our feet, subtle at first, then growing with dreadful clarity, recalled a mill worker whose testimony survived in municipal archives. Families went about routine chores, children played in puddles that would soon be rivers, and townsfolk joked nervously about the weather. The singular disappearance of a stable, a barn, or a livestock herd upstream would have seemed inconsequential, merely anecdotes easily overlooked. But in hindsight, these were the first casualties of a water wall that had begun to assert its power. At precisely 3:10 in the afternoon, the dam collapsed. Contemporary reports describe it as a roar, an unnatural sound that reverberated through the valley, shaking windows, rattling roofs, and drowning out every other noise. Water surged forward with a force beyond comprehension, carving a path of destruction 40 miles per hour, tearing through farms, homes, and the iron and timber bridges that connected the town. 33 locomotives were ripped from their tracks, sucked into the current, creating deadly obstacles as they collided with buildings and debris. The flood carried not just water, but a collection of human endeavor tools, furniture, livestock, and belongings, all swept along with lives that would soon be documented as fate unknown. Official records indicate that over 2,200 people perished that day, a staggering number in a community of 30,000. Entire families vanished, leaving behind nothing but fragments of memory and occasional belongings, letters, clothing, or a lone shoe drifting down the river. Survivors' accounts describe being carried atop floating debris, clinging desperately to the remnants of homes or furniture, witnessing neighbors, friends, and strangers alike swept away their fates, unknown. One report, preserved in the archives of the Pennsylvania Historical Society, recounts a baby surviving the entire catastrophe strapped to the floor of a house that drifted more than 70 miles downstream, a singular instance of survival amid wholesale destruction. Newspapers of the day attempted to capture the enormity of the event, though language fell short of the horror. A city drowned beneath a wall of water homes, obliterated as if by a wrathful hand, and cries of the living mingling with the roar of the rivers, wrote the Pittsburgh Gazette. Eyewitness testimony recorded by reporters detailed the collapse of structures, not only along the riverbank but further downstream, where the floodwaters carved new channels, uprooting trees and dragging debris across streets. Fire ignited from gas lines and stoves in destroyed homes raged atop the accumulated wreckage on the covered bridge, consuming those who had miraculously survived the initial flood, leaving charred remains among the twisted metal and wood. Letters and diaries provide a haunting layer of human experience. One steelworker wrote, "We saw the waters rising as though some giant hand had swept them from the hills. I clung to the roof, the timbers shifting beneath me, the cries of my neighbors carried away on the wind. Fate has spoken and we are lost." Another entry from a teacher who survived by floating on a doorframe simply states, "Some were swallowed in a moment, others burned in the fire on the bridge. The waters took everything, life, memory, and even hope." These contemporaneous accounts, preserved in municipal archives, are chilling for their matter-of-fact tone, a stoicism that belies the singular horror witnessed. The official inquiry following the disaster noted multiple contributing factors: negligence in dam maintenance, the obstruction of the spillway by debris, lack of early warning systems, and extreme weather conditions. Yet, even in the face of detailed investigation, many questions remained unanswered. Why had the engineers failed to warn the town despite signs of imminent danger? How could a structure so monumental succumb so suddenly? The facts provide figures, names, and statistics, but they cannot fully convey the terror of being swept along by the flood, the sensation of losing control as familiar landscapes dissolved into chaos, or the singular sense of fate unknown that enveloped every soul in the valley. Reports also document the rapid mobilization of relief efforts, one of the earliest major interventions by the American Red Cross led by Clara Barton. 5 days after the disaster, aid workers arrived to tend to survivors, to recover the dead, and to attempt a semblance of order amid the devastation. Their accounts describe entire neighborhoods obliterated, the riverbanks littered with detritus, personal effects, and human remains, and the survivors traumatized beyond comprehension. The archival photographs and sketches from that period depict a valley unrecognizable, a tableau of destruction where nature and neglect collided in a manner both factual and eerily symbolic, leaving behind an image of singular loss that history has not forgotten. Even within the meticulous records of newspapers, engineers, and relief workers, threads of mystery persist. Some reports speak of individuals who disappeared without trace, swept from sight before anyone could aid them. Others describe improbable survivals: the child on the floating floorboards, the man clinging to a tree for hours, then found miles downstream. These singular occurrences, while documented, defy easy explanation, straddling the line between fact and the almost supernatural odds of survival. The language of the time captures this duality. Fate, unknown, singular disappearance, mysterious occurrence, phrases repeated across articles, diaries and reports emphasizing both the known and the unknowable, the human endeavor and the overwhelming power of water unleashed. By the end of the day, Johnstown was no longer a city as it had been. It was a tableau of destruction recorded in meticulous detail, lists of the dead, the injured, and those unaccounted for. Eyewitness testimony, official reports, and newspaper accounts forming a lattice of human experience and cold fact. Yet these facts alone, no matter how detailed, could not capture the full magnitude of loss. They laid the foundation for understanding, but also opened the door to folklore legend and the haunting echoes of a singular event that would define the valley for generations. The flood did not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, between the young and the old, between factory workers and their children. As the wall of water roared down the valley, ordinary streets became death traps, homes became vessels of horror, and the citizens of Johnstown were forced to confront the raw, unrelenting power of nature in a way no human had imagined. Some were carried along on timbers torn from houses, their screams merging with the roar of rivers and the thunder of collapsing structures. Others clung to furniture barrels, or even livestock floating helplessly while the current swept them past, friends, neighbors, and family members all swallowed in minutes. There was no pattern to survival. Some lived by luck, some by quick reflexes, and some against all odds by a strange combination of desperation and instinct. One woman, Mrs. Eleanor Carmichael, would later recount in a letter preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society the sensation of seeing her home disintegrate around her. I grabbed the children and we floated on the kitchen table, the water swallowing the walls and then the floors beneath us. The roar, oh, the roar was in our heads, in our chests. It became part of our very breath. I saw neighbors lifted by the current screaming, grasping for anything, everything, and then gone, fate unknown. Her letter trembles between calm recollection and hysteria, capturing the liminal space between life and death as the waters transformed the familiar valley into an alien world of chaos and horror. In another account, a steelworker named Thomas Redding described climbing onto the roof of a neighbor's house, feeling the timbers shift beneath his feet as the water tugged relentlessly. I saw the bridge downstream, engines, wagons, and pieces of homes piling up, and then it caught fire. People who had survived the initial flood were trapped on the wreckage, screaming as flames consumed them. I thought I would die there, watching the fire devour what little humanity remained in the floodwaters. Fate unknown. Every instant became a lifetime of terror. These individual testimonies, painstakingly recorded, create a tapestry of human struggle, desperation, and resilience, threads of personal horror woven into the fabric of collective tragedy. Children bore the brunt of the disaster in ways that are almost unspeakable. Accounts tell of infants clinging to floating debris, of toddlers carried by parents who lost grip and vanished downstream, of siblings swept apart by the violent currents. One baby, miraculously unharmed, remained on the floor of a house that floated more than 70 miles from Johnstown, reaching distant communities in a surreal act of survival. The sheer improbability of such an event blurred the line between fact and legend, a human miracle amidst unthinkable destruction. Rescue efforts during the flood were minimal and perilous. Those who tried to aid neighbors were often swept away themselves. Ropes, boats, and whatever small vessels could be assembled were insufficient against the magnitude of water racing down the valley. Volunteers who braved the flood described the sensation of being caught in a vortex of debris, the weight of objects crushing and dragging, the scream of the waters above and below, the strange stillness between destruction that seemed almost supernatural. Survivor accounts mention hearing voices calling from beneath debris, children crying in places no human should reach, and the unsettling sensation that the waters themselves were aware, intent, and relentless. Even in the aftermath, the human toll continued. Those who survived the initial rush of water faced fire disease and the psychological trauma of witnessing mass death. The bridge downstream, clogged with debris, caught fire from lamps, stoves, and other flammable materials. People trapped atop the wreckage faced a dual threat: the water that had carried them and the flames that rose above it. Many were burned alive despite having escaped drowning. Survivors spoke of an acrid, choking smoke mingling with the scent of mud and decay, of people calling for help only to be ignored or unreachable, of a valley transformed into a liminal, hellish landscape where ordinary rules of life and death no longer applied. Eyewitnesses noted strange, ghostly phenomena in the days that followed. Some described seeing figures moving along the riverbanks half-submerged, drifting among the debris only to vanish when approached. Others recounted hearing cries at night echoing from the river, carrying the memory of the dead in sounds too precise to be wind or animals. Survivors spoke of dreams and nightmares that seemed tethered to the flood itself, dreams where the waters returned relentless and all-consuming, a singular occurrence replaying endlessly. Even reporters and relief workers noted a palpable tension in the air, a sense that the valley itself retained memory of the disaster. Its shadows thickened its waters, speaking a language humans could no longer interpret. Amidst these horrors, the human spirit persisted. Communities rallied in the immediate aftermath, attempting to locate the missing, tend to the injured, and recover what they could from homes obliterated. Yet the task was monumental. Official reports recorded thousands unaccounted for, and even those counted among the living bore deep psychological scars. Clara Barton and the American Red Cross arrived 5 days later, and their efforts, chronicled meticulously in letters and newspapers, were monumental. The recovery of bodies, the provision of food and medical care, the orchestration of temporary shelters, but they could not erase the trauma imprinted upon the survivors. Personal stories of heroism and sacrifice pepper these accounts. One man reportedly stayed in a collapsing house to rescue neighbors, only to be swept downstream himself, emerging hours later, bruised, battered, and alone. Another account tells of siblings who clung to one another atop floating debris, navigating the chaos until rescue arrived. These vignettes humanize the catastrophe, creating intimate windows into individual suffering and courage, highlighting the fragility and tenacity of human life against forces beyond comprehension. By combining first-person testimony, journal entries, newspaper reports, and survivor recollections, the human dimension of the Johnstown flood emerges with stark clarity. It is not merely a story of water and structural failure. It is a tale of desperation, instinct, miracle, and horror. It is the story of ordinary people confronted with the extraordinary of lives intersecting with fate, unknown of survival against incomprehensible odds. The flood left an indelible imprint on memory, shaping not only the physical landscape, but the psychological and cultural one, seeding folklore, shaping community narratives, and embedding the singular terror of that day into the very identity of Johnstown and beyond. The human scene of the Johnstown flood is thus more than a recounting of events. It is a visceral immersion into the lived experience of catastrophe, a meditation on mortality, resilience, and the thin line between life and death. It is the voice of the valley speaking through those who endured it, through stories that traverse the boundary between fact and legend, leaving us to confront the uncomfortable truth that humanity, no matter how industrious or prepared, can be swept away in an instant by forces it cannot fully command or comprehend. Even as the floodwaters receded, the valley of Johnstown remained haunted, not only by the debris and destruction, but by the weight of unanswered questions, by the whispers of fate unknown that lingered in every twisted beam and floating fragment. Official reports cataloged the dead, the missing, and the damaged infrastructure with precision. Over 200 souls gone, hundreds of homes obliterated, bridges torn apart, trains dragged into the river. Engineers' records documented the neglect of the South Fork Dam, noting weak points, clogged spillways, and inadequate reinforcements. Photographs, though grainy and limited by the technology of the era, captured flattened streets, the skeletal remains of buildings and survivors staring from rooftops, their expressions frozen in shock and disbelief. Yet these records, as detailed as they were, could not convey the full terror experienced in the valley, nor could they explain the improbable survivals, the miraculous escapes, and the eerie events that residents would later recount. Among the factual accounts, a recurring pattern emerges: individuals or families who vanished entirely, leaving no trace except for fleeting mentions in newspapers or diary entries. One such report tells of the Milligan family whose home was reportedly lifted from its foundation and carried downstream. No bodies were ever recovered and no belongings survived. Their fate remains unknown, noted a local official, the words heavy with finality and dread. Another report mentions a lone fisherman swept into the current while trying to rescue livestock. His body was never found, and local legend later suggested he appeared along the riverbanks in spectral form, guiding or warning travelers during storms. These accounts, factual yet incomplete, formed a lattice of human loss interwoven with mystery. As the survivors returned to the devastated town, folklore began to seep into the narrative of the disaster. Residents spoke of voices carried on the wind above the river, faint cries that seemed to echo the dead of shadows among the floating debris that moved with a will of their own. Some claimed to see figures climbing from wreckage only to vanish before anyone could reach them. Children would whisper about seeing the baby who had floated 70 miles on the floor of a house, as if the child had become a spectral observer of the valley's tragedies, a living testament to both survival and the uncanny. Old-timers who had witnessed previous floods began recounting tales that blended reality with legend, tales passed down in hushed tones in homes and taverns. They spoke of the river as a sentient force, a living entity capable of punishing human hubris, a river that remembered and acted with purpose. One story tells of a woman who wandered the riverbanks in the nights following the flood, claiming to see her lost husband among the drifting debris, beckoning silently before dissolving into mist. Another recounted a group of survivors discovering that the waters had carved eerie patterns into the landscape patterns that resembled faces or figures, and that these impressions were never fully erased by time. Newspaper clippings capture both fact and folklore in uneasy coexistence. The Johnstown Tribune reported on unusual phenomena along the river in the days following the flood, documenting sightings of floating lights and unexplained sounds amid the wreckage. These reports, often dismissed at the time, became seedbeds for the valley's growing mythology. Survivors themselves, in letters and diaries, wrote of dreams that mirrored the flood, of waking visions, where the waters returned, carrying away familiar streets and faces, of a sense that the valley itself had been altered in its essence, its memory haunted by the events of May 31st. Even practical observations bore a tone of eerie inevitability. Surveyors and engineers returned to assess the damage and noted that certain debris had been deposited in patterns that seemed unnatural, almost deliberate, as if the flood had choreographed the destruction. In subsequent years, locals would point to the arrangements of toppled trees, twisted iron, and shattered timbers as evidence of the flood's strange intelligence, a narrative woven into the collective memory alongside the official reports. Relief workers also contributed to the folklore layer, though unknowingly. Clara Barton and her team documented accounts of survivors who claimed to have seen apparitions, figures warning them before the dam collapsed, or hearing cries from the waters that could not be explained. These statements, though anecdotal, were recorded alongside practical reports of rescue and aid, creating a dual narrative, one grounded in meticulous relief efforts, the other steeped in mystery and the uncanny. There were also reports of miraculous coincidences, improbable survivals that defied statistical likelihood. Some individuals found themselves carried to safety by floating structures that would otherwise have been lethal, while others escaped from fires atop debris that should have consumed them. Letters and diaries record the survivors' own disbelief, their sense that they had been spared for reasons beyond human understanding. These events were woven into the oral history of the town, giving rise to the notion that the flood was not merely a disaster, but a trial, a confrontation with forces beyond human control, where both death and survival carried elements of fate unknown. The intertwining of fact and folklore persisted as Johnstown rebuilt. The flood became a touchstone for storytelling, with narratives shifting subtly over time to incorporate both verified events and spectral embellishments. Families recounted the loss of neighbors and friends alongside sightings of ghostly figures in the rebuilt streets. Schools taught the event as history, while whispers of spectral survivors circulated privately. The valley became a landscape where memory and legend coexisted, each informing the other, the floodwaters' echo never fully dissipating. In sum, the fact layer 2, combined with folklore layer 2, reveals a valley transformed not only physically, but psychologically and culturally. The Johnstown flood of 1889 was at once a human tragedy documented meticulously through reports, diaries, and photographs, and a story that transcended the limits of fact, seeping into the realm of legend and haunting memory. It is a place where the line between history and myth is blurred, where singular disappearances, fate unknown, and miraculous survivals coexist with accounts of fires, debris, and the relentless force of water. This duality between reality and the uncanny creates a narrative that is cinematic, visceral, and enduring, a story that continues to resonate more than a century later, haunting both the mind and the valley itself. As the waters surged, the true magnitude of destruction became undeniable. Entire streets were obliterated in seconds, homes reduced to floating debris, and the river became a corridor of chaos, carrying with it not only timber and steel, but lives torn from their foundations. Eyewitnesses recalled the sheer speed of the flood, how it moved like a living thing, aware, relentless, indifferent to please or struggle. Some noted that the roar was not only audible, but tactile, a pressure that pressed against the chest and bones, a vibration that seemed to echo the valley itself. In the aftermath, investigators recorded phenomena that confounded understanding: debris, piled in unnatural formations. Personal effects found miles from their origin, and most hauntingly, individuals who vanished entirely, leaving no trace of their existence. Singular disappearances catalogued in official reports, yet untouched by explanation. The fire atop the debris-laden bridge downstream added another layer of horror. People who had survived the initial surge of water were trapped, their cries mingling with the roar of the river and the crackle of flames. Official documents describe the intensity of the heat, the rapid consumption of timber and debris, and the blackened, twisted remains of what had moments before been homes or livestock barns. Survivors' accounts recorded in diaries speak of floating past, burning wreckage, seeing friends engulfed in fire and hearing the screams echo over the waters. Fate unknown, each second, a test of instinct, each movement potentially the last. One observer noted, "I thought the water would kill us, yet the fire became the greater predator, consuming the living and the dead alike." Among the most confounding and mysterious elements were the improbable survivals. A baby reportedly clung to the floorboards of a house for 70 miles, emerging unharmed in distant towns. A group of factory workers managed to cling to a single piece of floating timber, surviving where all around them succumbed. These singular occurrences, while verified in reports and personal accounts, were so extraordinary that they bordered on the miraculous, blurring the lines between survival and legend. The human mind struggled to reconcile the randomness of death with these improbable escapes, leading to questions that no documentation could fully answer. Journal entries from that day provide insight into the psychological toll of the disaster. One steelworker wrote, "I floated past friends and neighbors, their faces frozen in terror, yet some unseen hand guided me to safety. How can one explain this? Why did I live while they did not?" Another letter recounts the contradictory observations of residents who claim to have seen ghostly figures along the riverbanks, figures that seemed to warn of danger before vanishing into the mist. These accounts, preserved in local archives, reveal a duality between fact and perception, between the tangible destruction and the lingering sense of the uncanny. Reports from relief workers also provide clues to the magnitude and strangeness of the event. Clara Barton herself documented survivors who described the river as having a will moving debris and water in a manner that defied ordinary physics. Some recounted voices calling to them from debris. Others saw apparitions of lost loved ones, fleeting glimpses that could not be verified but left a lasting impression on those who witnessed them. The interplay between documented reality and reported supernatural phenomena created a narrative that was simultaneously horrifying and unexplainable. The investigation into the dam collapse revealed negligence, yes, but also raised questions that remain unresolved. Engineers' notes suggested the structure was compromised, yet the suddenness of the collapse and the extent of the destruction exceeded theoretical predictions. Some debris patterns indicated water movement that seemed almost deliberate, directing the flow in ways that maximized destruction. While these could be coincidental, survivors and investigators alike noted an almost poetic cruelty in the flood's path. Homes destroyed, families separated, and structures like the bridge that caught fire transforming into instruments of further horror. Fate unknown, the flood's choreography was both calculated and chaotic. Newspaper accounts juxtaposed fact and legend in a way that amplified the horror. Headlines screamed of "a city erased in minutes" and "the roar of the dam," heard for miles, while columns within described impossible survivals and ghostly sightings. One report mentions a man who, after floating past the inferno, found himself back near his home hours later, unsure if he had traveled by current debris or some inexplicable force. Another account describes the echo of children's cries over the valley at night in the days following the flood, haunting the survivors and reinforcing the sense that the disaster left not only physical destruction, but a spectral imprint on the town itself. In the culmination of these events, the Johnstown flood became more than a natural disaster. It became an intersection of human error, natural force, and the unknowable. The flood did not merely destroy. It challenged comprehension, leaving survivors and historians alike grappling with impossible questions. Why did certain people survive? How could the debris pattern be so peculiar? Were the apparitions real or the product of trauma and imagination? The valley itself seemed to remember to retain the echoes of that day, and every subsequent storm carried whispers of the singular horror that had once descended. The climax. The apex of terror and awe lies in the simultaneous enormity of destruction and the minutiae of human experience. Every floating object, every scream, every charred beam contributed to a tableau of horror that both shocked the senses and haunted the imagination. Each report, diary, and testimony forms a thread in a tapestry where fact and legend intertwine. Survivors confronted fire and water, life and death, witnessing the fragile boundary between survival and annihilation. The floodwaters of Johnstown were merciless, yet the human spirit's ability to endure, to cling to debris, to survive the impossible, imbues the narrative with a strange mixture of despair and awe. And as one contemplates the river valley today, long rebuilt and seemingly peaceful, the echoes remain singular disappearances, fate unknown. Miraculous survivals and ghostly recollections linger in stories, letters, and local memory. The climax of the Johnstown flood is therefore not just the instant the dam broke, not just the terrifying minutes of water and fire. It is the collision of human fragility with overwhelming natural force, the interplay of fact and folklore, the way a single catastrophe imprints itself indelibly upon both landscape and consciousness, leaving questions that have never been fully answered, and stories that will never be forgotten. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, Johnstown lay in ruins, a city both physically shattered and psychologically scarred. Streets once bustling with commerce and daily life were now carved with debris, twisted metal, broken timbers, and the remains of homes that had once held families, meals, and ordinary lives. Survivors wandered in shock, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling as they sifted through what remained. They counted the bodies they could find, cataloged the names of the missing, and attempted to piece together a semblance of order from chaos. Yet the singular disappearances, the fate unknown of countless souls, remained unresolved, a haunting reminder that not all could be reconciled with fact. Clara Barton and the American Red Cross had arrived, their presence a beacon of relief amidst despair. Yet even their tireless efforts could not erase the profound sense of loss. Aid workers documented the destruction, provided care for the injured, and attempted to bring solace to those left behind. Yet there were moments when the physical labor of recovery could not touch the intangible weight of grief, the invisible scars carried by survivors, the questions that would never be answered: who was lost forever? Why did certain families vanish, and how could a single day erase so much of what had been built over decades? Letters preserved in archives capture fragments of these experiences. One survivor wrote, "The streets are empty, yet I feel them walking beside me. The river carries their memory, and I cannot forget." In the wake of the flood, folklore and legend became inseparable from the historical record. Residents spoke of figures glimpsed along the riverbanks, shadows moving with uncanny precision, floating lights on the water that seemed to follow or guide those still trying to navigate the wreckage. Some recounted hearing cries carried by the wind voices of the lost, calling to the living in tones both mournful and accusatory. Even the land itself seemed altered. Hillsides bore scars that would never fully heal, and the river, although calm in subsequent years, seemed imbued with memory, a reminder that the valley had witnessed more than mere physical destruction. Stories persisted of miraculous survivals. The baby who drifted 70 miles on the floor of a house became a symbol of hope, a singular miracle amidst overwhelming tragedy. Others recalled improbable escapes, people clinging to floating beams, trees, or furniture surviving hours or even days in the waters. These accounts, while factual, took on mythic proportions in collective memory, transforming the flood into a narrative that straddled the line between history and legend. Letters, diaries, and newspaper clippings preserved the factual details, but oral histories and whispers of the uncanny carried the story beyond statistics, embedding it in the valley's psyche for generations. The reconstruction of Johnstown began slowly over 5 painstaking years. Homes were rebuilt, streets cleared, and industry gradually returned. Yet the shadow of May 31st, 1889 lingered. Families rebuilt on land, scarred by memory. Townspeople told tales of the flood to children and visitors alike, emphasizing the fragility of human life and the overwhelming power of nature. Annual commemorations arose, combining factual remembrance with ritualistic reflection, blending historical documentation with the folklore that had emerged from the disaster. Schools taught the events, engineers studied the dam failure, and historians chronicled the human toll. But alongside these efforts, the spectral narratives persisted, stories of whispers, visions, and echoes that could not be cataloged or explained. The psychological aftermath was profound. Survivors suffered not only the loss of family and property, but also the weight of what they had witnessed. Dreams and nightmares replayed the events, creating a shared trauma that rippled through communities. People spoke of seeing loved ones in fleeting glimpses along the river, of hearing cries in the night, and of the uncanny sense that the valley itself remembered each scream and each moment of survival. The flood became not just a disaster, but a touchstone for understanding human vulnerability, resilience, and the interaction between human ambition and natural force. Even decades later, Johnstown endured further floods in 1936 and 1977, yet none matched the horror and scope of the 1889 catastrophe. The memory of the South Fork Dam's failure became a warning etched into engineering manuals, safety regulations, and civic planning. Engineers studied the miscalculations and neglect that had led to the collapse, understanding that human oversight could never fully tame the elements. Yet the human stories, the singular disappearances, miraculous survivals, and spectral accounts persisted, illustrating that no number report or photograph could fully encapsulate the lived experience of that day. In this way, the Johnstown flood exists on multiple planes simultaneously, as historical fact documented with precision, as a human tragedy experienced intimately by survivors, and as folklore whispered across generations, imbued with a sense of mystery and awe. It is a story that resists closure, a tale where questions remain open, where the echoes of screams, the flow of water, and the memory of lost lives continue to haunt those who study or visit the valley. It is a singular occurrence, a moment in time, when nature's fury intersected with human error to produce a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, and yet within that catastrophe, the improbable, the miraculous, and the inexplicable thrived. As we reflect upon the events of May 31st, 1889, we are left with more than history. We are left with questions, with echoes, with memories that defy finality. How many were truly lost, and how many survive only in the stories of those who live to tell? Were the visions, the shadows, the voices reported by survivors real, or do they reside solely in the minds scarred by trauma? The valley does not answer, and perhaps it never will. It holds the past within its hills, its rivers, and its scars, allowing us only to glimpse the enormity of the event, and to imagine the lives that were irrevocably changed, the singular disappearances, and the fate unknown that accompanies every tragedy. You have just heard the story of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and the catastrophic flood that claimed over 2,000 lives, a disaster recorded in meticulous detail yet forever intertwined with legend and mystery. If you found yourself captivated, horrified, or moved by the courage and tragedy of those who lived and died, leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts, your reflections, or the questions that haunt you. Perhaps in doing so, we keep alive not just the facts, but the memory, the echoes, and the humanity of Johnstown's singular tragedy. Subscribe to continue exploring the hidden, the forgotten, and the extraordinary moments in history where human life meets the unimaginable and the echoes of the past refuse to fade.